Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Since our first podcast, STRATEGIKON has deliberately chosen to look at the perplexing international trend that appears to be Western weakness and decline and the reinvention of strong functional autocracies. At the center of all this sits Russia. President Vladimir Putin's legacy to the world of international politics has been the gradual acceptance of the sort of autocracy that, while certainly not emulating the old Soviet Union, has Soviet characteristics embedded within a broader gangster-like freewheeling capitalism tied to organs of the Russian state. Arguably, Putin's success in projecting this sort of soft autocracy has emboldened other leaders such as President Xi of the People's Republic of China, presenting the West with a massive conundrum. In a post-ideological neoliberal age where money talks across all sectors of society, people who make money in a free political environment will happily trade with like minds in non-democratic societies. The idea that this economic exchange will automatically lead to autocratic states liberalizing politically over time has been put to rest for now. In the public mind, however, reinvented autocracy of the type that today's Russia and People's Republic of China represent has led many seasoned observers to suggest that in spite of these states' obvious economic, social and political deficiencies, the order they bring and the strong hands they represent to their societies are in some ways acceptable, even serving a social good. After all, Russia and China are big states, too big to fail. If they did fail, who'd pick up the pieces? But this, from a geopolitical perspective, is dangerous thinking. It suggests that Western pushback, if ever considered desirable, may prove potentially catastrophic under most circumstances. The West's fear of escalation therefore becomes the primary tool Moscow and Beijing uses to get its way. They calculate the West will not be united enough or committed enough to take strong action militarily or diplomatically to curb the strategic impulses of today's rising Eastern autocracies. In Russia's case, this is made all the more obvious due to its desire to be seen as a first-rate military power. Its involvement in the Syrian civil war, its outreach to fellow autocracies in Turkey and Iran all point to Russia's ambition to carve out a large geopolitical space from which it can disrupt and influence other countries. Its recent Vostok 2018 military exercise therefore should be seen from this vantage point. Today we are joined by special guest to STRATEGIKON, Professor Julian Lindley-French. Over the past couple of years, Julian has kindly allowed us at SIA to republish some of his excellent pieces on European security. Julian Lindley-French is Senior Fellow of the Institute of Statecraft, Director of Europa Analytica, and Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, National Defense University, Washington, D.C. An internationally recognized strategic analyst, advisor, and author, he was formerly Eisenhower Professor of Defense Strategy at the Netherlands Defense Academy and Special Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of Leiden. He is a Fellow of Respublica in London and a member of the Strategic Advisory Group of the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington. Also joining us today is SIA's Associate and Resident Existentialist Philosopher David Olney. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that STRATEGIKON can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. The massive Russian military exercise Vostok 18 took place between the 11th and 17th of September 2018. Almost a month after this exercise, as a seasoned military observer, Julian, what can you tell us about this military maneuver?
Well, there were two major objectives that General Gerasimov wanted to test. One was what he calls non-standard solutions. He wants the Russian military to overcome specific challenges they might find on the battlefield. In the past, they've been a bit formulaic, in fact, very formulaic, in the way they've gone about preparing for things, and therefore when things go wrong, it tends to stop. as it did during Soviet days. The second element was innovation. I think for me, one of the most important elements of the entire Vostok 18 exercise was this new heavy air assault group, i.e. designed primarily to move forces between different military districts, in this case Central and Eastern Military District, but clearly part of the growing Russian capability to move mass quickly across distance, which is worrying NATO commanders.
In terms of the first issue there, Julian, of people becoming more flexible and more adaptable, are we kind of seeing what happened in the US Marine Corps in the 1990s with the creation of the strategic corporal? Are we seeing a Russian version of that? This idea that people need to become more autonomous, more able to make their own decision for their small team, having the resources they need and then just getting on with the job? Or is it something very specifically Russian we're seeing?
I would say, David, that it's more specifically Russian. I find it very hard to believe, given the culture of the Russian armed forces, that the kind of flexibility of mind, of mission command, if you like, that exists in the US Marine Corps, with whom I've had the pleasure of working, could be replicated in the Russian military. I think Gerasimov is looking more back towards Ogarkov in the 1980s, and the problem they had with things like follow-on force attack and air-land battle, whereby NATO, with a much smaller force, demonstrated it could disrupt the echelons that would follow on the initial assaults. And therefore, he's trying to build a greater resilience in depth of Russian forces in the event of a major confrontation.
So, Julian, do you think that the exercise met Moscow's expectations in terms of further professionalising the Russian armed forces?
Well, there were two objectives, main objectives. One was political, strategic, was to, exaggerate the number of forces involved, nothing like the 300,000 they talked about, probably more like 50 to 70,000 in reality, to again create this idea that they're an unstoppable force that must frighten the heart of those of us in Europe. Second, it was to communicate strategic partnership with China, whilst at the same time reassuring China that a major exercise on China's doorstep was not a threat to China itself. So there were complex military strategic objectives. At the military level itself, yes, it's a follow-on to ZAPAD 2017, Vostok 2018. Shoigu, the defense minister, has said that he wants to repeat this level of exercise every 5 years or so. Now, that costs a lot, but the objective of producing this mass maneuverable force that can be shifted around Russia's borders in any strategic direction, and that was strategic direction is a key here, is clearly the objective. It's fascinating watching what the Brits are doing right now. The British are carrying out an exercise called Saif Syria 3 in Oman, which is actually designed to counter the kind of things the Russians are doing with a much smaller force. So again, echoes of Germany in the mid-1980s.
It's very interesting that the Brits are immediately responding. My question sort of goes back one step earlier, and we can come back to the Brits after that if John or you would like to. But to what extent was this exercise also for home consumption for Russians, to convince them that the lack of money in the conventional economy, the hardship of life, is justified by the professionalisation? Was this really a buy the nation off, justify the patriotism exercise? Were there nearly as many Russian military film crews out there as there were actual units? Do we know?
Well, the answer is yes. There were as many Russian film crews of various sorts, or there was a significant number thereof. This is Russian propaganda, domestic and external. You look at the whole post-Ukraine propaganda, talk about the Great Patriotic War and the threat from fascists and all this kind of language. Clearly, the regime and the survival of the regime is built on the idea of Mother Russia once again being mighty, respected and feared. The question then becomes just for how long the Russian people would put up with a situation in which society is not being developed along the lines of a modern economy, which Russia, frankly, needs to do because its economy is less than half the size of the UK's and about the size of Italy's. So how long this kind of nationalist drumbeat will work for the regime is a case in point. It all presupposes they can maintain this vision of NATO, the Americans and the West still being a threat. The great paradox, of course, is that Europe is its biggest source of foreign income, and in a sense, the Europeans are funding this Russian military machine. And whilst Russia, on one hand, paints the West and Europe as a kind of strategic threat, and yet also needs Europe to fund it, that is the essential paradox at the heart of Russian domestic policy.
It would seem to me that the other side of that is too that the import substitution programs have cost Russian a fortune. There's some economic analysis that says the Russian treasury is basically empty. So it would seem that part of this too is showing the Chinese, look, we're a good military partner. Can you provide all the stuff for us more cheaply than our import substitution program? Because otherwise we're going to go bankrupt and you won't get access to military technology or a military partner. So it's both an awkward balance with the West, but also an awkward balance with the East.
I think that's a sound analysis. I would say that the Russian current account, i.e. Russia itself, the state, doesn't carry much debt. And Russia's military power purchasing parity is much greater than, say, Europe, UK specifically. I mean, General Milley, in his testimony to Congress in March, pointed out that if you took out the personnel costs of the US military, and then you combined Russian and Chinese expenditure, the military outcomes they develop are not that far short these days that the US can develop on a much bigger budget. So we have to be a bit cautious on that. As for the Chinese actually despise the Russians. They're enjoying their sense that they are now in the box seat here, that China will call the tunes in this relationship. I was in Beijing some time ago, and it's very clear what they think about the Russians as a junior partner, a very junior partner. So at some point, Russia itself might have to pivot away from a strategy which, in a sense, is locking weakness into their entire system. And to my mind, the biggest threat to the West and to Europe in particular is not Russian strength, it's the contradiction between a state that is economically weak, unreformed, and yet carrying a very, very heavy security state structure.
Again, John and I have talked about this in earlier podcasts, that it seems to us from very far away with a lot less good information that the real problem of Russia is it's trying to do one thing, but it can't anymore use its body to pay the checks. It keeps issuing the checks, but there's just no finance left, no muscle left. And that the consequence of this will be only greater instability, greater desperation, more opportunity for the Chinese to twist them in knots, a more awkward relationship with Europe. So the desperation will just get worse and worse.
It worries me, frankly, David. I mean, I think the Chinese will exert pressure on Eastern Russia, the Russian Far East, simply by the sheer weight of their economy and their influence. And Russia is clearly worried about that. The corollary of all this is that, first, don't underestimate the ability of the Russian people to suffer in the name of Mother Russia.
No, they can suffer forever, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we tend, particularly in Europe, to try to look at Russia through European eyes. And they see the world very differently outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, the average Russian. So, a Russia that is, again, powerful in their eyes, you see the cult of Stalin re-emerging, for example, is one that buys a lot of political traction inside Russia, outside the metropolitan, relatively liberal elites. And the Russian state, if the oil price and gas price rises, which is showing signs of doing, can probably keep this trick going for some years. The danger is if at some point there's a cataclysmic collapse and the regime is tempted into more adventurism simply to survive. This is simply a regime survival strategy. Then we have to be on our guard against that. So it's not a strong Russia that really worries me, although its breaching of the International Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, Conventional Forces Europe, are indeed worrying trends because they show a flagrant disregard for the rules-based system we thought we had in Europe. allied that to persistent European self-imposed military weakness, and there you get the possible ingredients for a perfect storm, in which at one point, at some time, at some place, Russia might be so militarily dominant, with the Americans overstretched and hard-pressed in your part of the world, that they might be tempted to do something. And that's the reality that Europeans simply have to wake up to.
I just want to try to drill down a little bit on some of these issues. I mean, Russia is still very much a European power. The bulk of its industry and its population base is in the European part of the Russian space. I mean, the underdeveloped East is always going to be cause of concern because it is not only underdeveloped from an infrastructure perspective, but it also is underdeveloped in terms of its population space, which makes it uniquely vulnerable. But why do you think now is the time that Russia has decided to create this massive exercise to show or to test its veracity in the East, when we know that the Chinese do have much more going for them in terms of wanting, if they want to or choose to exert pressure on Russia's eastern peripheries, ultimately the Chinese win, right? So what's all this gamesmanship about? I mean, ultimately the Russians can put up a bit of a stoush, maybe poke the Chinese in the eye in the end, but that's really where it ends, doesn't it?
Well, I think the Chinese and the Russians are looking at this in a kind of classically 19th century realpolitik way. For me, it's a kind of reverse Nixon-Kissinger. If you remember back in the early 1970s, 71, where Kissinger first and Nixon went to China to kind of drag China away from the kind of idea of a kind of Comintern, that there was a kind of, fraternal brotherhood, as it then was, between the Soviet Union and communist China. And it worked. China, for various reasons to do with the South China Sea and its influence therein, see some utility with its One Belt and Road strategy of using Russia towards its own strategic ends of strategic influence. So there's a kind of almost like a kind of symbiotic relationship right now between Russia and China, given where the two countries are and given that they are both illiberal regimes. Much
of the PLAN equipment is still Russian derivative. The Chinese haven't fully gotten rid of that kind of baggage. I mean, it keeps them tied to Russia, and even with regard to a lot of its aerospace technology as well. So in that sense, I mean, the Russians do have a couple of cards to play with the Chinese.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and they're producing good kit, the Russians.
Yes, indeed.
I mean, if you look at things like the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, or you look at the S-400 air defense system. This stuff is really very advanced, and I made a film last year which I sink Britain's new aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, because she is insufficiently protected against that kind of hypersonic technology. The Russians and the Chinese are doing a lot of work on artificial intelligence and drone technology, and also the Russians are developing what I call 4D warfare. This spans across the kind of hybrid cyber high-end future warfare that I'm currently writing a book with General Allen and General Hodges of the US. Mm-hmm. So, don't underestimate the Russians. They are doing some very, very innovative work at the Milstrat level. Mm. And they've got things the Chinese can use. But ultimately, China's objective is to wait until it has the wealth and the power where it is in the box seat. It won't do anything too spectacular until then. Mm. But if China ever gets in a position where it is the dominant political, economic, and indeed military power in Asia and perhaps wider, then expect rough times ahead, and then I would suspect the Russians might want to switch sides.
Well, that's when we get the interesting question of eventually how many Chinese migrants either live very near to the Russian borders or end up working land inside of Russia for agriculture. Part of this thing of the new heavy lift capacity of the Russian military must be able to show that they can swamp the Chinese border if there's a problem with Chinese immigrants and Chinese farmers and workers and economic zones inside Russia. So the Russians, as ever, paranoia drives them to always go on the offense. And yet in China, it is eventually they're going to need to be paranoid, and there is going to be a need for offense because the relationship just is as bad as you've been describing. It's so much of convenience now, but with nothing long-term to underpin it or make it stable.
It's fragile. I mean, at best it's fragile. And I think you have to look at Vostok 18 probably against, for example, the big leap forward exercises that the Chinese carried out, where they moved significant forces over distance of 3,000 kilometers, interestingly, from the south of China to the north, towards the Russian border. So they are signaling partnership. So, yeah, China and Russia will always be prickly partners, which I would suspect is an avenue for our own diplomacy in the West.
If we jump back a step, Julian, because it was very interesting, if potentially we need sophisticated diplomacy to deal with this prickly Chinese-Russian relationship, we also need a sophisticated potential military response. And you mentioned earlier the British exercise currently going on Oman to deal with such sort of potentialities. What can you tell us about this British exercise?
Well, first of all, it's far too late and far too small. I've been warning against this for years. I mean, British defence policy right now is a mess. It's basically run by the Treasury, and it's how much threat can we afford?
Yeah,
which is hardly the way you go about doing sound strategic defence planning. You compare SIA Sharia 2 with SIA Sharia 3, the one currently ongoing. There was 4 times the force in SIA Sharia 2 than there is being deployed for number 3. And then you compare it with whatever the Russian forces were in Vostok 18. There was at least 1,000 aircraft involved and probably 5,000 tanks. The Brits have 5,500 troops, 8 Typhoon aircraft, 18 tanks and 4 ships. Now, with due respect, that ain't going to frighten anybody.
It sounds very much like the kind of exercises we're getting in Australia because everything after Afghanistan is worn out. So literally, exercises look terrible now.
Yeah, that's true. And the simple fact is that Britain, with a top 5 world economy and a 65 million population, has a military that's far too small for the power that Britain still is. Whereas Russia, with its burgeoning military and expensive military, has a force that is far too expensive, complicated and big for the Russian economy. And that's the essential tension that's at play here. Because, as you say, without a stick, speak softly but carry a big stick, without a big stick, when dealing with the likes of Moscow and Beijing, they won't listen to diplomacy at the end of the day. We Europeans are going to become far more serious about this, not least because the Americans are going to be ever more stretched thin the world over. And they face the perfect nightmare of a potential scenario in East Asia, Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Europe at the same time. And there, Europeans would need to be effective first responders, which right now we ain't.
If we look at this from sort of a military personnel problem perspective, as well as a strategy issue. So here in Australia, after coming out of Afghanistan, we've had the exodus of very experienced, very talented people, tired, end of career. I'd assume you're having the same thing in the UK, that you've lost a generation of talent who wondered why they went to the war, done their bit, are out now. Where are the Russians at in comparison? With this professionalisation, are they actually at the point where young, capable guys go to the Russian military because there is nothing else in a dysfunctional economy? Are they turning people away because they are getting the best? Where are they at personnel-wise versus the West?
Well, the comparison is interesting because the most damaging impact of the 2010 Strategic Defence and Security Review in the UK was that it decimated the entire experienced non-commissioned officer corps, the backbone of the Army, the backbone of the RAF, and the backbone of the Navy. A lot of very experienced NCOs left, fed up, morale very low, which it remains very low. Recruiting has been difficult because the economy has got a very high level of employment at the moment, and because the assault on patriotism, as I would put it, by the elite over the last 15 years, hasn't made it particularly sexy to be patriotic in the UK anymore. So, you almost get a sense of at times of a military ghetto that's defending a society that doesn't give a damn about it or the wider world. Contrast that with Russia, where you have an underdeveloped economy and society that is being mobilized through propaganda, where the Russian military is the backbone of the great patriotic war narrative that has been pumped out. And whilst there have been some recruiting problems, there's still a much greater incentive to defend as Putin would say it, Mother Russia, then there is a dynamic to defend Mother Britain in the UK, or indeed across much of Western Europe right now.
With regard to that, and talking about patriotism, I mean, we've got a similar problem here in Australia in terms of recruitment and the idea of actually trying to drum up the kind of social support necessary for, can we say, redoubling our military efforts when we have to. But one of the things that is really interesting, with 11 time zones stretching from Europe to Asia, from west to east, and from the Arctic Circle in the north to the harsh steppes and deserts to the country south, I mean, how realistic is it to defend multiple parts of this vast and diverse Russian geographical space? We were talking earlier about technology, and we can't underestimate Russian technology. But surely there is a point at which, the physicality of defending this massive space, especially with regard to what you were saying earlier, the lack of Russian economic heft. I mean, who's paying for all this, and how, and where are these limits going to be touched upon, moving forward? Obviously, there are certain things that Russia can show off, but then showing off in a controlled setting is one thing. Unleashing its military forces in a warlike state is a totally different kettle of fish, isn't it?
Well, there's two responses there I'll give you. One is the same challenges that create a dilemma for the defense of Russia also create a dilemma for anyone attacking Russia. Unless you get to Moscow, it's the old Napoleon Hitler thing. I mean, when have you defeated Russia? So that plays to their advantage, advantage as well. They have what I would estimate to be a 30-day high-end military, which could steal a bit of land, grab land, and stop, and then present a fait accompli and say, do you want to go to nuclear war with us over a bit of land, i.e. could be the Baltic states, and therefore boost the prestige of the military. So, again, I think that the danger is that we look at Russia through our eyes and therefore project an image of weakness which perhaps the Russian leadership themselves don't see. What they see is a West that's decadent, that is in decline, that simply doesn't want to deal with these issues, and therefore the ability for them to commit war at the seams of society that are increasingly fractured, partly because of multiculturalism and the retreat from patriotism, is very great indeed. They are a strategic hooligan, which could cause very considerable mischief, primarily because our leaders will not face up to fundamental realities of strategy and power.
We'll now take our customary musical interlude. You're listening to Strategikon, the podcast of SIA.
Can you hear the drums, Fernando? I remember long ago another starry night like this. In the firelight, Fernando, you were humming to yourself and softly strumming your guitar. I could hear the distant drums and sounds of bugle calls were coming from afar. They were close now, Fernando. Every hour, every minute seemed to last eternally. I was so afraid, Fernando. We were young and full of life, and none of us prepared to die. And I'm not ashamed to say the roar of guns and cannons almost made me cry. There was something in the air that night. The stars were bright, Fernando. They were shining there for you and me, for liberty, Fernando.
That was the 1980 pop classic Fernando by Swedish group ABBA. Now we'll return to our coverage of Russia and its Vostok 2018 military exercise.
Yeah, 30 days of high-end war is also 30 days of media coverage. So in a sense, if the Russians do those 30 days well, our media's already shown the disastrous consequence for Western forces, and the political elite have gone, we're going to lose the next election. How do we get a compromise to get out of the pain?
That is the case. And, let me put the question back to you blokes, which is, imagine this scenario. Desperate Russia, economic collapse pending, social unrest, attacks the Baltic states, closes the Suwalki Gap between Belarus and Kaliningrad, some 100 kilometers long, issues an order to NATO forces to get out, NATO forces withdraw, and then Russia stops. Moscow rings, say, Berlin, and says, do you really want to go to nuclear war over the Baltic states? Now, if they achieve that, which they could roll over the Baltic states, I would estimate, in about 3 days. So does Rand, by the way, in Washington. Do you really think that Europeans would truly go to war over the Baltic states? In a sense, NATO's bluff would have been called and NATO would be finished. Mm-hmm. It would look great in Moscow, limited war gain. And in a sense, back when you see General Gerasimov, he doesn't talk about de-escalation by escalation to nuclear weapons, but he implies it. It would be very, very hard to imagine that Europeans would be willing to go to war over the Baltic states, and I fear for my Baltic friends because of it.
How did NATO see Vostok 18 then? Is NATO up to the task of defending Europe?
NATO, without the Americans, is not up to the task of defending Europe. NATO needs the Americans. NATO is deterring Russia. But the whole strategy is designed to create a tripwire in the enhanced forward presence to raise the level of risk to Russia. I'm not confident that what's behind the enhanced forward presence, the NATO command structure, in a circumstance in which the Americans will be engaged elsewhere, say in Asia Pacific, once that started, that NATO Europeans would be strong enough to be effective first responders. General Hodges and I, my friend Ben, we've done a lot of talking about the need to improve military infrastructure in Europe, road, rail, other links, all that stuff that was there during the Cold War that could move large military formations rapidly in the event of an emergency is gone. So the only advantage that has now is if Russia ever thought of coming further west than the Baltic states, which it isn't thinking of, it couldn't move very fast itself. But we have to stop the Russians ever being in a position where they would think such adventurism would work, because I fear that given their limited strategic objectives, which to my mind are perhaps the Black Sea, the Baltic states, and the North Cape of Norway to protect the ingress and egress of the Russian Northern Fleet, if they ever got hold of them, I think they'd have them. And I don't think we would be credible in trying to push them back.
When we met in London last May, we talked about the funding problems that NATO was having and the fact that perhaps President Trump had a point in terms of his wanting the European partners to lift their game in terms of how much money they were prepared to put forward to collective defence. I mean, from your perspective, are you seeing anything positive happening on this front?
I'm seeing a few relatively partial developments towards 2%, but nothing decisive. I'm seeing Western Europeans in particular who really are playing games with figures, including the Brits. I mean, the way that Britain assesses its 2% is very different to how it assessed it back in 2010, when the cost of nuclear weapons were not included in the defence budget. So I see nothing strategically decisive to tell me that Western Europeans have really bought into this, in despite of the fact that they all signed up to the Defence Investment Pledge back at the Wales Summit in 2014. The worst of all is the Bundeswehr, Germany. The state of the Bundeswehr is frankly a disgrace. And the backbone of any European land component would be the Bundeswehr. Whereas the British are investing in things like new heavy aircraft carriers, new nuclear attack submarines, a new nuclear deterrent, which signals to me that given the size of the British Army, it's only about 78,000 strong right now, that in fact the Brits are increasingly retreating behind their nuclear deterrent and will sail off with the Americans into the sunset. So the defence of continental Europe is looking increasingly threadbare if the Americans cannot get forces in strength into Europe in an emergency, and that worries me, frankly.
It's quite incredible. From so far away, the sense we get here is that the Europeans have bought into the idea that, well, we're Europe and we're nice to each other, so therefore everyone else wants to be nice. It's almost like they can't conceive of the necessity of the strength required to guarantee security. And it doesn't seem that anything is going to change that. And where you were talking earlier about the fact, well, the Chinese are only going to get more and more capable, pull more American resources away. This is likely to enhance Russia's gambling, take a risk even more. Because if more and more US stuff and potentially British stuff is in the other half of the world, the Russians know that really they're not dealing with NATO. They're dealing with an America that's sick of it, a Britain that conceives itself as now largely outside of Europe, and the French sitting against the channel going, well, we're part of this mess, but we're far away, so let's just ignore the mess.
I think that's right. I think there's a lot of posturing inside the alliance right now, and I think part of the problem is the nature of the European Union. I wasn't for Brexit. I don't like the European Union or the elite of it in the way it governs, but I wasn't for Brexit because, to my mind, an essential British interest is to have influence on the continent, and the EU is a mechanism to do that. Britain needs influence in it, but the EU has become a kind of political anthill that is completely unstrategic. It's obsessed with the day-to-day negotiations between each other over how to make this damn institution work. And that very process over 40 years has made most European leaders strategically illiterate. They don't understand big power and its application, whereas the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians do. So, whilst the Europeans are constantly trying to play chess, Russia, China, and America are playing poker, and this is a kind of appeasing reality. So, my fear is that until shock comes, and as an Oxford historian, I look at the panoply of force against the backdrop of history, and I fear that shock is coming, and that shock is being accelerated by Europe's willful weakness, and that in turn is reinforced by the very small leaders that Europe has because of the nature of the EU.
With regard to Europe and the way that it's kind of structured at the moment, we see a lot of friction between NATO members and Turkey, and we see Turkey starting to strike up much warmer relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia. Do you think that this is a trend that will continue for the duration because both Turkey and Russia see it in its mutual interest? Or do you see this as a temporary aberration, considering the fact that Russia and Turkey are traditionally considered rivals and foes in the Black Sea region? What effect will this have on NATO if Turkey decides to throw its hat in the ring with the Russians?
Well, the Turks will only throw their hat in with the Russians in a very partial manner. Look at history, Crimea War and all that. I mean, the partnership between Turkey and Russia, if there is one, isn't very strong over Syria, for example. Russia sees Turkey as useful only in screwing NATO, to be blunt. Erdogan, as long as Erdogan is in power, he will say that Turkey is now a conditional member of the alliance, that you have to buy Turkey's support, because, for years the Turks pretended that they were going to be given EU membership, and the Europeans pretended they were going to give Turkey EU membership. Well, that game's now up. And what you tend to have inside NATO now is the likes of the Cypriots and the Greeks blocking, inside the EU, blocking Turkish ambitions, and of course the Greeks are inside NATO as well, often blocking Turkish ambitions. So what Erdogan is saying is that, both to Putin and to Europe, mainly Berlin, is you will both have to buy my support, and that support might be for hire, but it's conditional. I don't see a Russo-Turkish axis developing because of Turkey's problems with, say, Iran, which Russia does have a close relationship with. I see Turkey perhaps more leaning towards Saudis. Of course, the issue of the Kurds will complicate the whole factor of relationships. I see Turkey looking towards the Middle East as more of a strategic danger to itself, and therefore realigning the focus of its defence to what's happening in the Middle East, which is worrying, frightening, if more than worrying. So Turkey's going back to be the power that it traditionally always has been, that willing to do business in a kind of strategic bazaar, but never willing to commit itself fully to kind of alliances that are enduring. And therefore, given Turkey's pivotal position in Europe's security, look at a map, given Turkey's pivotal position literally in the whole concept of a 360-degree NATO that was agreed at the Wales and Warsaw summits, where NATO could potentially defend both against an aggressive Russia, but also against the likes of Islamic State across NATO's southern border, which at the moment is simply not feasible. Turkey has cards to play, and for that reason will continue to exert pressure on Europeans, continental Europeans in particular. One final thought on Turkey. I'm fascinated as an analyst why continental Europe has a problem at the moment simultaneously with its three major external powers, Russia, Turkey and Britain. And one of the great failings of a German-led continental Europe is its inability to hold up a mirror to itself and see it as others see it. And this is because Germany is so needy of the idea of Europe to justify its own leadership in Europe that it finds it very hard to look at politics in terms of realpolitik, which of course it invented, and is fixated with ideals of the idea of creating a Europe, which in many ways is a kind of German Zollverein. Germany is extremely uncomfortable with its own power, and yet German power is a fact of life in the balance of power in Europe. And therefore you have this skewing the way that Germany and therefore Europe looks at the balance of relations in Europe itself.
It's really interesting you say that, Julian, because one of the things I've taught in multiple security courses at the University of Adelaide is teaching the students about Baader-Meinhof in the 1970s. This group that were trying to make young Germans realise that the West German state was still essentially the remains of the horrible pre-World War II state as they saw it. But essentially what they were saying is this new habituated niceness, this new habituated softness, the rejection of violence as a solution is so abnormal and unhealthy, it's better to, in a sense, become terrorist to force the state back into being a normal German state. So, in a sense, we've got a Europe that swallowed the Red Be Peaceful pill and is suffering terribly as a consequence.
I buy your description of Baader-Meinhof. I don't buy their strategy or the consequence of what you suggest, David. I mean, I'm very comfortable with German leadership of Europe. There's a great book that I love called The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, and the opening lines are, "The past is another country, they do things differently there." The past is indeed a different country compared with contemporary democratic, almost overly liberal Germany. But the ghosts of the Wilhelmine and Hitlerian past, for obvious reasons, dog it. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Berlin. I'm part of a group called the Leusach Group, a high-level US and German group, looking at how to make the US-German relationship, which is, frankly, the most important strategic transatlantic relationship now, work. But when you're part of that group, it's very clear that the German-US relationship is an essential relationship, but it's not special, because they look at power, they look at coercion, they look at the role of military force within the broader applications of harder power in a completely different way because of history. The Americans, like the British, still tend to see it as being a good force for good ends. I would suggest that the Germans are still deeply uncomfortable with the German state ever having really powerful military capability because they cannot escape the ghost of their own past. It's almost as though Germany still fears itself. Yeah,
it fears what would happen if they took the leash off, that things would go horribly wrong for them.
And that's what Baader-Meinhof back in the 70s and 80s, of course, were appealing to. A constituency within Germany that feared itself.
Julian, we've run a number of podcasts examining Russia's contemporary strategic power projection in Syria. Has Russia's 2015 intervention into the Syrian civil war on the side of Bashar al-Assad had a positive effect on the way the Russians see themselves, and was this confidence on display during exercise Vostok 2018?
To some extent, in terms of Russia's ability to exert military power again beyond its borders with ghosts of the Soviet engagement in the Middle East. But the jury's still out on that. We're probably going to face a bloodbath in Idlib. And if we do have a bloodbath in Idlib as a regime with Russian very strong backing ends the insurgency, that could well put the Russo-Turkish relationship under great strain. But, at present, the Russian people are just beginning to realize that in Ukraine and in Syria they could be facing a similar situation to that which the Soviet Union faced in Afghanistan post-1979, which is, as long as the cost is not too great and there are not too many sons of Russia coming back in body bags and families being pressured to keep the deaths of their sons quiet. If that continues, if that grows, if Russia finds itself, trapped in a quagmire in the Middle East and elsewhere, then I think that more than anything else might undermine support for Russian adventurism in much the way it undermined support in the Soviet Union during Afghanistan, and indeed the Iraq and Afghanistan quagmires undermined support for foreign force projection in Western Europe and indeed America itself. So, we're at that cusp now between, is Russia a successful adventurist, or is it about to find out that none of this stuff is easy and there will be a significant price to pay both internationally and domestically?
Well, that really depends on pushback. And at the moment, with a Trump presidency that seems to be, still very open to the idea of having warmer relations with Russia, that doesn't seem likely from the US perspective. And as we've just been discussing, it seems very unlikely from a European perspective. So, toss a coin, Julian. Where do you think it's going to go?
Well, right now there's a vacuum, John. And the Russians are exploiting that vacuum, a vacuum created by Western weakness, partly by the administration in Washington, which, it's relatively cheap for Putin to exploit. But if you look at the administration's deeds rather than their words, they are much more aggressive against Russia than the president himself. Look at the response to the Skripal attack in Salisbury. More sanctions being cited, which are causing the elite quite a considerable problem. Then I think you will see a return to more traditional American views of Russia at the height of the administration, because, Russia is interfering in the West. It is committing egregious acts of violence as part of its political warfare against the West. It's also being humiliated by the West at the same time. Forget all this Bellingcat stuff. It's clearly the Brits behind the exposure of GRU incompetence, which is humiliating to Moscow. So there are limits to how far Moscow can play the strategic hooligan game. Where it will go? Well, my sense is the question is for Moscow. Yeah, for a time you can play a successful game as a defector. For a time you can keep your opponents off balance if they're far stronger. But over time, strength matters. And the inherent weaknesses of Russia as a power will begin to tell. And therefore, at what point, if any, will Putin and the elite around him decide that, okay, we've made hay for 10 years, we've had some fun, we've embarrassed the West, we've made NATO question itself, but the fundamentals of Russia's economy and society require an accommodation with the West. If not, we're headed to a road to hell and in a basket rapidly. Let's hope that Moscow wakes up to the logic of its own aggression at some point.
Just thinking that this gets us back to our point from before. That's the point where potentially they do that desperate dive into the Baltic states as a last gasp to go, look, we did something with all the power. Look, we can rattle them. Look, they'll back down. Look, at the end of the day, we've still got nukes. And then there's that grab, and then there's nothing, because that's used up a heap of the 30 days of high-intensity warfare, equipment and personnel. And then it's a question of when do the lights start going out, and people question the legitimacy of, well, what next beyond belligerence?
But then you start to see the utility of Nord Stream 2, for example, the gas pipeline between Germany and Russia. That's less a pipeline to pump gas directly to Germany, avoiding Central and Eastern Europe, and more a pipeline for pumping euros into the Russian economy. I can foresee the Putin regime, as it gets more desperate, playing a kind of super North Korea strategy, which is basically, it might all collapse, it might all get nasty, therefore how much are you prepared to subsidize us to keep us in power? And remember, behind Putin is possibly people who are even more aggressive and unstable. I think of Khrushchev Senior and Junior. So the blackmail strategy of getting Europe to fund the economy in return for the appearance of Russian strength is one that I think could well emerge more acutely over the coming years before we get to the kind of doomsday scenario of an attack on the Baltic states.
Again, what you just described seems the most likely thing for years, doesn't it?
Yeah, and frankly, it might work. I mean, I think Germany will be willing to pay a lot of money simply to stop Russia behaving too badly. And certainly that might be effective. But at the same time, it might not. And therefore, we really do have to speak softly but carry a big stick and make sure that our stick is big enough that the risk factor for the regime itself outweighs any possible benefits they would gain from adventurism.
Sort of ironic in a way, because, on the one side, Germany will kick up a huge fuss about bailing out the Greek economy, but on the other side of the equation, looking at Russia and looking what it could potentially do to Europe, they don't necessarily have a problem with the idea of bailing out the Putin regime, because we have this theory in the West that things are now too big to fail. We don't let things just fall on their backside like we're used to. And perhaps that's part of the problem. Perhaps we just have to come to the conclusion that sometimes, powers outlive their usefulness and they have to go. And pump priming them isn't necessarily going to be in anyone's long-term interest.
German-inspired policy in the European Union towards Greece and to some extent towards Britain over Brexit is about a sort of, you think of Voltaire, Candide and Admiral Byng when he wrote that Admiral Byng was executed on the quarterdeck of a British man-of-war pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. Greece has been punished because it ignored the rules of which the EU is run by. And therefore, the German punishment of Greece and that of others, as well as Britain, is about exercising discipline on those who ignore rules or choose to leave rules which they signed up to. The German attitude towards Russia is about engaging those who simply ignore the rules and deal purely in the instruments of power. So, me as a Brit or an Americans might not like the fact that Germany sees the use of levers in power as being essentially non-military. But there's no reason to believe why a state like Russia wouldn't actually be influenced by the use of German euros, as, by the way, they were in the immediate aftermath of unification of Germany in the 1990s. So I can foresee a situation where there's a range of instruments, Germany emphasizing more civilian, soft financial instruments, the Americans and the Brits doing what we've always done, which is, with a penchant for things that have a big US flag or a big white ensign on the back, because they look good. Between us, I think we can fashion a policy which will contain Russia, but I think it will take both.
Strategically speaking, can we expect closer ties between Moscow and Beijing as Beijing's relationship with the US declines due to its ongoing trade war? I mean, will Chinese defensiveness against what it sees as a hostile US government drive the PRC into the arms of Russia in a more profound way through a formalised alliance structure?
Only on Chinese terms. I mean, my first posting was Hong Kong many, many years ago, so I got some insight into the Chinese mind. Look, I mean, for all the current friction over trade with Trump's America, for all the friction over the South China Sea, with Japan, over Taiwan and unification, and of course with Korea, the Chinese are actually very cold-minded about these issues. They will take the appropriate course of action commensurate with buttressing and strengthening Chinese influence over time and space. They won't do anything that's particularly spectacular if it's going to work against the longer-term Chinese interest. Whereas the Russians do precisely the opposite. The Russians, are sort of hell-bent on a series of spectacular, costly, but ultimately possibly self-defeating choices. My sense is that Chinese at some point will discipline the Russians and say, okay, yeah, you can have a partnership with Russia, with China, with us, but on our terms. And by the way, you will let us know before you do anything, because we will tell you whether we think you should do it or not. So the real strategic competition in the 21st century is indeed between America and China. I think America will develop the West as an idea rather than a place, as its main weapon of countering China. And that means that the West will include Australia, Japan on one wing of America, Europe on the other wing of America, and possibly India as well, if Chinese-Indian relations become more strained. Therefore, ultimately the paradox of all this is the idea that is the West, liberal democracy, rule of law, open economies, still has the fundamental tenets of strength that even a China cannot contend with and at some point will have to deal with. Therefore, I think a sophisticated administration in Washington, and I'm not one of those Europeans who jumps up and down about the Trump administration like some, but a more sophisticated administration would start to enable the leverage that is the global West to contain China. And this Skype link becomes strategic reality because we're all in this together, guys. We're on one thing of it, and you're on the other. And I think that's why Australians are talking to Europeans again about the strategic reality of a globalized world.
Julian, thanks very much. That's a wrap. And thanks for joining us for your first time on Strategikon.
My real pleasure, guys, and have a good day. Take care, mate.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategikon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn and YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our product, and we look forward to engaging with our colleagues. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.